So go ahead and let me know
Okay, it
if
should
you're,
be coming up.
there it is.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, I am going to give just a quick overview on getting to know your soils. And I like to start out with this quote here. Essentially, all life depends upon the soil. There can be no life without soil and no soil without life. They have evolved together. And that was something that Charles Kellogg had written in one of the USDA yearbooks of agriculture. So we're going to talk briefly about what is soil, about the nutrients and pH of the soil, soil testing, the damage, what damages soil, and what makes good soil and how do we keep it healthy. And I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that this presentation was put together by Ariel Agenbrod as well as some other educators. And I've just modified it a bit for our presentation today. So what is soil? The non-living components of soil are approximately half solid matter. So about 45% is mineral matter, and then about 5% is organic matter, but of course that may vary depending on your soils. And then the other half of that is pore space, and that's either filled with air or water. And of course those percentages would change over time. The other important characteristic of your soil to think about is the soil texture. And so that mineral matter that is in the soil is described by particle size. The particles are described either as sand, silt, or clay based on their size. And the soil texture is then determined by the relative amounts of this sand, silt, and clay. And using a soil triangle, then you can determine the texture based on those percentages of sand, silt, and clay. And in some cases, when you can just take a jar of your soil and shake that up with water in it, let it settle out, and you can sort of see in the image on this slide, the separation, particularly in the bottle on the left of the sand in the bottom and the finer particles on top. So why is texture important? The soil texture is going to affect the water holding capacity, the nutrient holding capacity, or whether it's going to leach out, the permeability of the water through the soil, the workability of the soil, or the ability to dig or till in the soil. And because of these characteristics that are affected by texture, it affects the ability of the plants to grow. Here's just some examples. So the looseness or airspace or drainage of a soil that is more sandy is going to be quite good. Whereas if you have more of the finer clay particles in that soil, it's going to be poor. The moisture holding capacity as well is poor for a sandy soil then because it does drain out, whereas it's better for the clay or silty soils. Soil structure is then the arrangement of the soil particles or aggregates. Soil structure is the aggregation of the sand, silt, and clay into shapes with distinct sizes and strengths, as seen in the images on this slide. The soil structure provides additional pore space and open channels for movement of water, as well as nutrients, air, and plant roots. So, and one thing to consider, if soils are cultivated when they are too wet, then they can become compacted and they lose this structure. The plant roots and the addition of organic matter to the soil will then help improve soil structure. The other component that we think about within the soil is the soil organic matter. And that comes from decomposed plant and animal materials. It's a storehouse for plant nutrients, and it will improve physical structure and hold the nutrients and water in the soil. Usually maintaining 2 to 5% is best for production. And then there's also, so those were the non-living components of the soil, but remember that there are living components of the soil as well. So soil contains abundant living microbes and other organisms, including bacteria, insect larvae, earthworms, fungi. A single square yard of soil will contain 500 to 200,000 individual arthropods, and 2,000 pounds of bacteria may be active in each acre of soil. The nutrients that are involved in plant growth include the macronutrients, which are the nutrients that the plants use more of compared to the others, including nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then the micronutrients, which are the nutrients the plants do not require as much of for production, include boron, zinc, copper, manganese, iron, and molybdenum. And pH is important in the soil. There are certainly plants that benefit from having a certain type or a certain range of pH. And partly that's because the pH will affect which nutrients are available to the plants. So at certain pHs, the nutrients may not be available for the plant to take up. So to learn more about the particular soils that are on your property, conducting a soil test is a great way to get a good picture of what's happening. The University of Idaho does have a soil sampling bulletin that you can look at online, and it will talk about how to collect that sample that you then send off to a lab. You want to make sure that you're getting a good representation of your whole farming area, and doing separate tests for areas that may have separate soils. If something is a particularly wet spot compared to other areas on your farm, you may want to test that separately. And taking multiple subsamples that are then mixed together prior to sending off to the lab. And your soil samples should be taken to the depths that the roots are generally growing, about 10 to 12 inches. When you send it off to the lab, there's many labs around to send it to. But some of the basic tests that you can get include getting the pH of the soil, the nitrogen that's available. Oftentimes that's broken down in ammonium nitrogen and nitrate nitrogen, the available phosphorus and the available potassium, and then the percent organic matter. That's usually the standard fertility test for most of the labs. And then from there, you can expand that to include other nutrients that you'd like to explore. In this slide, it shows some results that also include the sulfate, sulfur, and boron. We mentioned this at the last class, but again, to get a broader picture of what type of soil you have, you can always go to the Web Soil Survey from the Natural Resource and Conservation Service website. So some things that will damage your soil include overgrazing, removal of soil organic matter, excess cropping, compaction, excessive tillage, over-fertilization, flooding, and erosion. Trying to work your fields either with equipment or even just by walking on them when they're particularly wet and snowy. This particular person has got a little too anxious, I think, and caught in a spring snowstorm. So you don't want to till your soil when it's wet. You want to avoid lots of passes with heavy equipment. Use size appropriate equipment for your area, and use composts, mulches, and cover crops to help increase that organic matter. And then hopefully you'll have a much nicer soil. It won't be compacted. You'll maintain some of that structure and have a good workable soil in your farm. And with that, I will pass it back over to Jessica.
Great. Thank you, Jen. If you have any questions for Jen about soils, you can type those into the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll answer those after Jessica's presentation. Okay, great, Jessica. We see your main slide. We don't have your volume yet. So let me double check.
Okay.
Oh, now I can hear you.
Okay.
Yes, I can hear you
Great.
now.
All right. So while she's presenting, if you guys can be quiet. Well, thanks for having me. And again, my name is Jessica, and I operate Swift River Farm, which is a certified organic farm in Salmon, Idaho, with my partner Jeremy Shreve. And trying to advance. Oh, here we go. Okay. So when we talk about growing healthy soils, we really want to start at the very beginning to see, because we have to know where we are beginning in order to know where we are going, right? So what kind of farm do you actually want to have? Because I can tell you what you need to do if you are going to be growing on a certified organic farm and what I think you should do. But that is ultimately up to you guys and on your farm operation, because the way you treat your soils, the way you grow your soils, it really lines up with what your values and practices on the farm are going to be. So spend a little time thinking about, are you organic, are you sustainable, are you natural, are you biodynamic, if you're growing livestock, are you free range, fair trade, are you a conventional farmer? So all of those things need to kind of be established before we start going. But ultimately, whatever you're growing, whether it's chickens, whether it's veggies, whether it's beef, you are actually growing your soil first. So throw whatever you thought you were growing out the window, you're actually growing soil. Then you're growing plants. Even if you're growing livestock, you're growing your soil, then you're growing your plants, then you're growing your livestock, and repeat over and over again, hopefully until the end of your farm life. So it's really important to write down that farm statement. On our farm, we talk about growing our soil. So we look at what our short-term fertility needs were when we very first started. The middle picture is Jeremy mowing a spot for the barn. When we first got this land 4 years ago now, it was nothing but bare pasture. And so we really had to assess what our short-term fertility needs were on the farm. And for us, fortunately, it was a irrigated, grazed pasture. It was really, really fertile, and it hadn't been tilled or cultivated probably ever, or if not for the last 100 years. So we had a lot of fertility going on for us. But given that, we don't want to just use up all of our nutrient load and then never think about it again. So we really had to establish what our long-term goals were for the farm. And that dictates what we do on the farm every single day in terms of protecting and caring for our soils. And then I'm always directing students, and I'll direct you guys back to looking at those on-farm resources. What do you have on hand at the farm to help you grow your soils? Do you have manure? If not, don't think that you're going to rely on manure as a fertility management tool unless you are really savvy with sourcing it from a neighbor. Or do you have a truck and trailer? Do you have a loader? Or you have strong backs if you're just whipping it out of a wheelbarrow? All of these things need to be considered when we talk about our soils, and what do you have on farm is really important to consider. When we look at growing our soil, we also look at our crop plan, and Diane did a wonderful job of talking about how we plan for what we are growing and how much, when will we cultivate it, when will we rest that land, how will we irrigate it. That really determines how we irrigate. Can be very detrimental on our soil health or not. Drip irrigation is great. It really is protective of soils, versus flood irrigation can be very detrimental, especially on uncovered soils. So flood irrigation can really carry nutrients away. So these are things to consider about soils, even though you're looking at what crops you want to grow. And again, looking at that whole farm plan. So what are your values, philosophies, and obligations? And how does that dictate how you treat your soils? Because we're certified organic, we have some pretty stringent rules that we're expected to follow in terms of soil fertility and what we can use on the farm. And so we do not have that wonderful steaming pile of manure in that middle picture. We just don't have any of those manure resources where we are. So we really rely on cover cropping and good rotations and green manures and living mulches to improve our soil health on the farm. But if you have livestock or if you have a healthy source of manure to compost, then you can certainly incorporate that into your soil plan. Also, I included these pictures too because for our farm, it's really important for us to maintain the integrity of the wildlife habitat around our farm and within our farm landscape. And so even though we do a lot of cover cropping and living mulches, our timing of all of that and incorporating it back into our soils is really important. Otherwise, we disturb all of that great habitat we've now created for the birds and for the pollinators and the bees. So just mowing schedules and things of that nature, we have to be really careful if we want to protect the critters around the farm. Jen talked a lot about soil fertility and what makes up good soils, the physical, biological, and chemical makeup of soils. I'm not a soil scientist. I am just a farmer. But knowledge is power, and I think all of that is really, really important. But I also have to temper myself and say, you know what, Jess? This compost has been happening for eons. These critters know exactly what they're doing. And I have to trust a little bit in that soil fertility and the critters, the microbes in the soil. They really know what they're doing. And so if I can have a big picture of understanding what's going on the farm, rather than micromanaging it too much, then I feel like we have better success on our farm. So I would suggest to you that definitely do a soil test, know where you're starting at with your farm landscape, but don't try to micromanage your nutrients too much. Go for the big picture. Go for the high organic matter and the long-term goals. It's a long game with organic or sustainable agriculture. There are no quick fixes. So even though you're going to get your soil test back and it might say you're low in nitrogen or you're a little bit deficient in potassium, don't be tempted just to do a quick fix and do a big blast of a single nutrient, because ultimately there's a lot at play that humans just don't understand yet. And so you can really kind of do some harm, I think, to your system if you rely too much on the Band-Aid approach. Oh yeah, there's no quick fix. Just keep that in mind. Make a plan and grow for it. I put this up there, this little graph, or not graph, a little chart, because at the top it says your goal. What is your goal? Build soil organic matter quickly, or is it to supply nutrients, or is it to improve soil structure quickly? And then you can follow those little lines down, and it gives you some good overall strategies that you can use on the farm if you want some results. But if you'll look at this, it's not really, there's no quick fixes in here. It's not dump in a bunch of Miracle-Gro or go down to the hardware store and buy liquid plant grow and everything will be fixed. It's adding organic amendments. It's taking care of your soil structure. It's resting your land. It's grazing or resting instead of harvesting. It's doing your good rotations, and it's planting cover crops. So just a realistic picture of what goes on when we talk about protecting and growing healthy soils. I shouldn't even put this slide on because I don't want you to get zoned in on be like, ooh, blood meal for nitrogen and foliage, or I can use cottonseed meal or fish emulsion, blah, blah, blah. So it's just an example of how you can fall into the rabbit hole if you're wanting to just treat for nitrogen deficiency or phosphorus deficiency, etc. There are tools out there to help you. and the soil tests are important for that reason. But ultimately, if you have a good rotation plan on the farm, if you have a good cover cropping plan, and if you are taking care of your soil structure, then you will not need any of these little amendments all the time. You might need them sporadically, but the long game, if you can keep that in mind and start doing those practices from day one, you'll have better overall success. We use a ton of cover crops, green manures, and rotations on the farm. Some of these are covered in other presentations also, so I'll just go through it quickly, but I sort of use cover crops interchangeably with green manure sometimes, but basically a cover crop is a crop that you intentionally plant and leave it in place to prevent erosion, maybe to smother weeds or shade out weeds. Maybe you're preventing the freezing and thawing of soils, or my favorite is just hosting beneficial insects and promoting diversity on the farm. A green manure is technically one of those cover crops that you then till back in or turn back into the soil, or you mow as soon as it flowers and you turn it back onto the land as a mulch or something. So you're using that cover crop for a very specific purpose in terms of nutrients, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, etc. One example of that is one of my favorite cover crops is buckwheat. I love growing buckwheat. It grows really fast and it scavenges phosphorus that's otherwise unavailable to plants. And so then I whack buckwheat down. It's really easy to turn in by hand, and it makes that phosphorus then available to other plants as it breaks down in the soil. Otherwise, phosphorus is one of those that it can be kind of tricky on how to sustainably source and bring up phosphorus levels in your field. Other types of cover crops and green manures include sweet clovers, but those, keep in mind, are often biennial or perennial and are kind of hard to incorporate by hand. So if you are adding sweet clover into your cover crop rotations or green manures, just know that it's a little trickier to turn in than some of the others. Hairy vetch is a great one, nitrogen fixer. Winter rye, barley, black medic, winter peas, mustards like Diane was talking about, buckwheat, oats, and then some weeds can also scavenge nutrients. So keep that in mind. Not all weeds are evil. Actually, most weeds are not evil. But the one on the very far end of the screen, the purple flower, that's another one of my favorites that we grow, is Phacelia, lacy Phacelia. And it makes a huge amount of biomass. It's a nitrogen fixer. The bees absolutely love it. And it's really easy to incorporate if you have a weed whacker or mower, even by hand if you just chop it down. There is, this link might be a little old, but I did search for the DVD series developed by Oregon State called Weed 'em and Reap, and it's a really great resource that talks about how to use cover crops as living mulches and then using a lot of mowing strategies on the farm, which we do a lot of. The other thing that is absolutely critical is to rotate your crops. And if you're not doing this, even on a big scale, if you're doing a 100-acre plot, you have to be rotating. Otherwise, if you grow the same thing in the same place year after year, you will develop disease, the plants will use the same nutrients year to year, and you're going to run into a lot of problems. So always rotate your crops. We use the Elliott Coleman schedules. Elliott Coleman is an organic grower. He has a bunch of rotation schedules in his books or online. So just check them out. We use a 10-year rotation, and it works really well for us. You can rotate mostly by plant families, but also by nutrient fixing or nitrogen fixing plants or different rooting depths. And of course, throw in your cover crops and green manures in there. Sorry, this is sideways, but this is just an example of 4 different beds within the landscape. And this isn't on our farm, but I just pulled it from from the internet, just for an example of rotations. And you can see the beets, carrots, potatoes, radish, turnips. Those are all like by root. They all grow underground. And so this person is rotating based on that. And bed 1, those roots will then follow the next year into bed 2, and it will just kind of rotate counterclockwise or clockwise. And then I love bed 4 because it's a specific area that's in a cover crop that's allowed to rest. And often on small scale farms, we're so crammed for space that we don't have those areas that the soil needs to rest. So if you can, try to incorporate those areas, or at the very bare minimum, be planting green manures. As soon as you pull up something from the ground, put in your cover crop and green manure, and just make it part of your practice. I was recently at an organic seed conference in Corvallis, and I met a grower from North Carolina who has been growing on the farm for 5 years, and they grow on a little less than 1 acre. And when I asked how many CSA members they have 180 CSA families off of less than 1 acre. And I think my eyes, you guys are all like, holy cow. Yeah, I felt the same. I was like, how is this possible? And I asked about the rotations, and they're like, well, we do we plant lettuce in one spot for 5 years, and then they put in compost and rotate. And then back in my mind, I felt like in my organic system that wouldn't be a good system for me. And perhaps they have different soils, they have different strategies, but I felt that in time they might run into some problems because they have a really long rotation for one single crop, and it's very intensive. They don't have zero room to rest their land, feeding that many people off of that small of a plot. But the bottom line, truly, even if you don't want to get scientific, or maybe you do want to get all sciencey about soils, is that if you get diversified on your farm, if you do a lot of different things and you always rotate and you're always paying attention, then you will do better at growing things. Sustainability is a continuum. We're just constantly evolving and getting to this magic point. We can always do better. So if you have healthy soil, you have healthy plants, you'll have healthy ecosystems. There's no right or wrong way to do it, but there's always a better way. So start paying attention. And of course, as tempted as you are is to use some of those soil amendments, the best amendment is you and your knowledge. And that's Jeremy, because he never gets to do these things, but he's always at the farm. I think that's it. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to help.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. One question we have is, what does allelopathic mean? You had a slide that you were talking about allelopathic plants.
Yeah, allelopathic just means that there are some plants out there that release these chemicals as they grow, and it inhibits the growth of other plants. One example is knapweed. Knapweed is allelopathic, and so that's why when you look at a big knapweed crop, which you've all seen, nothing else is growing there except knapweed, because it kind of just prohibits other things from germinating and growing around it. Another example is rye. Rye is allelopathic, and so that means that when we are using rye in our cover cropping, that we really want to be intentional about when we're pulling it out or turning it in, because that can prohibit the germination for a certain time period after rye has been there. Does that make sense? I hope.
Yeah, that does make sense. Thank you. I'm going to remind folks that if you have any questions, you can have your facilitator type them into the chat or the Q&A box. And while we're waiting for more questions to come in, I have a question, Jessica, about how you see the relationship between soil and what people might want to consider growing. So if somebody's just thinking about entering in to starting their own market garden or small farm, what would you recommend that they consider looking at their landscape and their soils while they're starting to think about what it is that they might be able to produce?
You know, when we we leased land at a couple different sites for about 9 years before finding our home sweet farm that we're on now. And we dealt with a lot of different soil types throughout the years. And it can be really challenging if you're trying to grow, you know, veggies, for example, was our passion, on really difficult soils. One of the sites that we leased had really heavy clay soils, and that made our yields and our it was really challenging to deal with very, very heavy clay soils. And so I would recommend, if someone was just getting started, that you go out and you dig a bunch of holes and on your property or your potential property, and you find out where the best soils are on that land, and you start from there. You start small. When we found our land that we ended up purchasing, the landowner at the time, she let us go and wander with a shovel and pick out the acreage that we wanted. She had about 80 acres total, and so we cherry picked our 10-acre parcel. And that whole summer before purchasing, we looked at what kind of plant growth was there versus the surrounding area. We looked for dandelions, we looked for lush vegetation, we looked for diverse pasture grasses and clovers. And so we were able to, without really doing a scientific soil test, we were able to, just by paying attention, look at what soil was good for our farm. So if you know what type of soils you have under your feet, then that can really help you determine what you want to grow. And maybe, you know, maybe you have some pretty lousy soils that are pretty nutrient deficient, and it's gonna, you have to spend a couple years just planting different cover crops to build up that organic matter. That is going to be more bang for your buck to do that than to try to struggle through the, you know, trying to produce something off of that ground for 2 years.
Thank you. The final question that we have today is, how often do you recommend soil testing? So you talked about soil testing when, you know, as your baseline. How would you recommend people consider soil testing? Like, what would that frequency look like? Yeah,
I think, you know, there's often a cost to soil testing, sending it off to a lab. So being realistic with yourself, I don't think you have to do it every year, but when you're, especially when you're first starting, maybe do it every 2 to 3 years. And then once you are growing for a while, maybe then you just do it every 5 years. Something along those lines, I think, makes a lot of sense. For us, we do it every, I don't know, every 4 years or so. It seems like we're doing a soils test. But that's an actual soil test that you send off to a lab. But if you really, you know, you can do pH tests, you can do your soil structure tests, all of those things you can do in the field, and we do that all the time, just to pay attention to what our soils are looking like.
Great. Well, great. Thank you. That's all the questions that we have. And so thanks so much for presenting today and sharing your experience with soils, both Jessica and Jen. So if you can stop sharing your screen, I'll share what is next. So it is now time for lunch. So at your local site, you're going to have time for lunch and networking until 1 o'clock Pacific